Hey, Dog Nation, I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. I apologize for the late start, and this truly is a late start. I'm not just running late. We are late, and I did mention this a couple times yesterday that today would be that way. Now, we take this very seriously. We try to be very consistent with our start times. We don't take a lot of days off. Did have a kindergarten orientation for my daughter today, so that's kind of a big day for us. In our household, I wanted to be a part of that and do all that kind of stuff. And yet at the same time, I'm also very mindful of, I realize that for those of you that watch on Facebook, you don't always get notifications. Sometimes you wonder, are we here? Are we not? We try to be very consistent so you'll know that we'll always be here. We obviously don't ask that you always be here. You're busy. You got things going on. The way I always tell people is, you may not be here every day, but we will be here every day and we'll be here when you're ready for us. So for those of you who are checking in here today a little bit late, appreciate you being here. Fun stuff today. Connor Riley later on. Connor going to be on the phone today, a little bit different for him. We'll talk about the commitment of Jared Wilson, or I should say the recommitment of Wilson. Some interesting chatter coming out of Gainesville. A couple things with the Florida Gators that we got to touch on. We'll have just a generally speaking, I think, pretty fun show here as we head towards the football season, maybe unlike any other that we've ever seen. But the SEC doing its part to give it a go here, putting its best foot forward. So we'll cover it all. We're glad to have you with us. DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So we'll begin with some interesting news for Georgia from yesterday as the three-star offensive lineman Jared Wilson out of the state of North Carolina, who at one point in time had been a UGA commit, flipped to North Carolina, recommitted to the University of Georgia, making it official on social media. If you're watching on video, you can see it on your screen. If you missed this news, check out Jeff Sintel's piece at DawgNation.com. You can find out more about Wilson. He goes into a 2021 class for Georgia that already includes Micah Morris and Dylan Fairchild, and possibly could include Amarius Mims here at some point in time. And admittedly, Wilson is a name that we have probably talked about less than some of the other guys I just mentioned. Certainly, we fixate on Mims because he's still out there. Morris and Fairchild are guys that have become, in their own rights, fan favorites with UGA fans. So we have covered them pretty aggressively. Terrence Ferguson, who Georgia missed out on recently, who chose Alabama, is also a guy that we've probably talked about more. We've talked about Wilson. But as a way of kind of categorizing who Jared Wilson is as a player, let me use a word that we don't really use much in modern times anymore. But if you ever watch like old movies, you see this a lot. You see this word a lot. The word is vouch. In modern times, we don't vouch for each other very much, but back in the day, I guess, at least if you watch a lot of old movies, especially like old gangster movies and things like that, someone's always vouching for somebody. Hey, so-and-so is a good guy. Hey, you can trust this guy. Hey, I'm going to send you over here to speak to so-and-so and just tell him I vouch for you. There's a lot of vouching for each other that goes on in old movies. We don't do a lot of vouching for each other necessarily today. I don't really know why that is. I guess we can just sort of Facebook stalk people and Google search them and find out all we need to know about people. You don't rely on someone's word to vouch for someone maybe the way that you used to. But in the case of Jared Wilson, three-star prospect, less discussed on a show like this one than the Morrises and the Fairchilds and the Amarius Mims, even the Fergusons. One of the things that you need to know about Wilson as a player, and one of the reasons that you should maybe look at him in a greater stature above his profile as a three-star recruit, is the fact that he was originally vouched for by Sam Pittman, well before Pittman ever left to go be Arkansas head coach, well before all the twists and turns that have kind of taken place with the 2021 class, well before all of that, Pittman was interested in Jared Wilson. This was a guy that got the vouch from Pittman, who knows offensive line recruiting as well as anyone could. Now, we'll get to Luke here in a moment. I think Luke vouching for Wilson ought to be enough in and of itself. But for Georgia fans who are still trying to figure out what's going on here with the class of 2021, if you just want to go back to a time in which many of you felt more comfortable than you do now, Pittman told you that Wilson, regardless of his profile as a recruit, regardless of how much more attention guys like me, kind of hype men, hyperbole guys, no matter how much we may have fixated on the more highly rated recruits, Wilson was a guy that that got a seal of approval from Sam Pittman. West Forsyth there in the state of North Carolina. It's a pretty good program. KJ Henry, for instance, the Clemson pass rusher, he came from that program. UNC's been red hot on a recruiting front as of late. Wilson being in the mix for their class of 2021. That's also an idea of kind of what he brings to the table there as a prospect. So Matt Luke, in the aftermath of probably missing on TJ Ferguson, that's a guy that Georgia probably would have liked to have. He chose Alabama. You wish him well on that. And if you're Georgia, you have to respond quickly. You move on and you say, okay, so Ferguson's gone, so what is there left to do here? You still got your hopes pinned on Amarius Mims, and there's no reason. Jeff Sentell has written a lot about this as of late. There's no reason to think that Georgia's relationship with Mims has dissipated at all, to use probably a bigger word than I probably should. But you've got need for additional offensive linemen. You know, you've got, as I said, Morris and Fairchild in the fold. I think in the case of Morris, he's always been, you know, pretty respected prospect. I think Fairchild's kind of come on as a house of fire lately as someone that I think is going to finish this 2021 cycle as a very highly rated recruit, already highly rated. I think he could be very highly rated before all of this is done. It's just an example of some pretty impressive work that Luke is doing right now at the class of 2021, made more impressive by the big haul that Luke put together in short order for the class of 2020. You know, when you think about Brodie Jones, you think about Tate Ratledge, when you think about Cedric Von Prawn, you think about Chad Lindbergh. These are all big-time gets, and in most of those cases, you're talking about players that have the potential of playing, and there are other offensive linemen, by the way, for the class of 2020. Let me just highlight those names because of that group. A lot of them have a chance to play early. A lot of them have a chance to be in the mix for playing time near the beginning of their Georgia career. So all of a sudden you look at short cycle in 2020, kind of a challenging cycle in 2021. Georgia's offensive line recruitment hasn't seemingly slowed down at all. You're not getting everyone you want. Josh Braun decommitted from the class of 2020. Ferguson chose Alabama over Georgia, as I said. But you are getting plenty of what you want. I mean, that Matt Luke gets a lot of the credit for that, which kind of leads me to this point on a day in which Wilson's reaffirmed his pledge to Georgia, and you look at all the other work that's going along with Georgia offensive linemen right now. Can you make a case, and this is more of a sort of a fun intramural argument between Georgia fans. There's no wrong answer here, nor is there any reason for anybody to get particularly steamed on one side or the other. There's plenty of room for that with some of the other college football debates that we have. But in this particular case, this is just sort of a more of a fun thing. Can you make a case right now? I believe that you can. Spoiler alert, I believe the answer to this question is yes. Is Matt Luke right now Georgia's best recruiter among assistant coaches? I think the proof is in the pudding when I mentioned what Georgia did do for Luke in a short cycle in 2020, what it's already done in 2021, how quickly it responded to what probably was a bit of a setback with Ferguson, and the fact that Georgia continues to be in a great spot for a five-star prospect like Amarius Mims. I don't believe you could ask for, nor do I think you should be expected to receive, any better recruiting work than what Luke has provided for Georgia thus far. His replacement for Sam Pittman, has turned out to be a very good piece of news for UGA and a bit of a bullet dodged when you lose one of your top assistants in kind of an unexpected fashion. No one would have ever imagined Sam Pittman leaving Georgia's offensive line coach, jumping to the front of the line to become Arkansas head coach. That's a little bit of an unusual career path, yet that's the way that it unfolded, and Georgia has responded quickly by bringing in Luke here, and it's time to, I think, appreciate the work that he's doing. No one among the Georgia assistants right now is out recruiting him in either the class of 2020 or the class of 2021. It's also probably fair to ask, how is Matt Luke getting this done? There's a piece of audio that I really enjoy from him going back to his time as Ole Miss head coach when he first transitioned to that role after having been an Ole Miss assistant who even back then was also a really good recruiter. One of the things that Luke talked about was the way in which he enjoyed building relationships, the way in which he enjoyed doing that part of it. And as a head coach, you're just not able to do that quite as much. And so in making the transition, you go back to his time in Oxford. That's one of the things that sounded like from him that he was actually going to kind of miss not being a part of. This explains a lot about Matt Luke as a recruiter. Take a listen to this old audio from Ole Miss.
That's the part I enjoy. I enjoy the relationship part of coaching. To me, that's what I'm good at, and that's what I enjoy doing. And it's just a much more broader scope and getting to know more people instead of just focusing on 3 or 4. You're more worried about the big picture, but it's all about building relationships, and that's the part I like.
So at the end there, he kind of veers into how those relationship building skills that he have are a little bit different when you're a head coach. Right now, Luke's not a head, and I'm sure he'd like to be a head coach again, and there's a very good chance that one day he will be. But for now, Georgia fans are getting to enjoy the very best of what Luke brings to the table, which is someone who's just sort of natural at building relationships. And this is one of those things that you either are or you're not. There is no script to read from here to be a good recruiter. If that's not in your bones, if that's not in your DNA, you're either authentic at that or you're not, and the proof is in the pudding for Luke when it comes to this. In fact, let's go back to one of the big recruiting battles that Luke won for the class of 2020. Remember Tate Ratledge? Ratledge had been a Georgia commit, loved Sam Pittman. When Pittman left Georgia, Ratledge had every reason to question his commitment to Georgia, especially given the fact that his family grew up with Tennessee fans. He had lots of other places he could have gone. He had every reason to wonder, is Matt Luke supposed to be the right guy for me? And frankly, it would have been a dereliction of duties for Ratledge's parents had they not allowed him to explore that and consider maybe we should go to another school besides the University of Georgia. This is not a binding contract. My commitment, I'm free to go where I want. However, on a pivotal visit after Luke had been hired, Luke won Ratledge over. Here's how Tate Ratledge told Jeff Sintel about it.
Great personality. He spent a whole day with me, and I love the guy. Me and him made a better relationship than I have with any other coach that fast.
Did you know that this was a guy you could play for 10 minutes of talking to him, or did you have to see him practice and work the guys?
I knew pretty much right off the bat, within 30 minutes of conversation, just his personality, just how personable he was with me, like keeping away from football, wanting to get to know me, my family, my friends. That was a big part of it.
I'm sorry, those words from Ratledge tell the story in just a few sentences any better than I could in 10 minutes. And to compliment Luke for the work that he's doing in the recruiting trail is not to disparage the work that anybody else is doing right now. Cortez Hankton had a great class of 2020. Some of the UGA defensive assistants, I think, are set up eventually to have a very good 2021 before the cycle's all said and done. Maybe a little bit of a slow start there in some of those regards. There are a lot of UGA assistants who are doing really well. I guess the point here, though, is none of them are outworking or outperforming Matt Luke. It was a big-time hire when Kirby Smart made it, and the dividends have really been paying off over the last few months. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Good to have you with us, no matter how you get to us today, live on video, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. A little bit of a late start for us video-wise today, as we told our audience we would be. We are, of course, rolling for the show as normal, though, and expect to be on time again for the foreseeable future, so apologize for the inconvenience on that front. Radio podcast at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. You should notice nothing different about your broadcast today. Podcast very much the same way. You guys listen on demand. We should pretty well get that delivered the same way we always do. But for the video folks, it was just a little bit different here today, so we apologize for that. Huge thanks to our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia for making the show possible. Of course, ESOG is a proud partner of UGA. Makes them fun to do business with if you've got any kind of waterproofing issue, foundation problem. Engineered Solutions of Georgia is a solutions-based company, which means they specialize in solving those kinds of problems. So they've got 2 full-time engineers on staff. This is smart people to do good work. Do not put off the work. If you see that wet spot, basement, crawl space, garage, somewhere like that, you notice those horizontal cracks in your foundation, don't put that off. The good news is it may not be that big of a deal. But the important news is, if it is, do not trust something like this, the structural integrity of your home. Don't trust that to some fly-by-night company, somebody that's just pretending to be an expert on this. ESOG's got 2 full-time engineers on staff. They're also really easy to get in touch with. Give them a call. Dial 678-ESOG now. That's 678-ESOG now. That'll get you in touch with my friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Good friends of DawgNation, proud partners of UGA there as well. All right. It's going to be Connor Riley on the phone here coming up in just a couple of minutes. Before that, there is some evidence emerging of something kind of interesting going on as the SEC expands from an 8-game conference schedule to a 10-game conference schedule. Apparently, it really was either initially thought that Alabama would be on Florida's schedule, or maybe that's indeed how all of this is going to take place. Joseph Goodman's a columnist for AL.com. He tweeted something yesterday that got my attention. This is what Goodman writes on Twitter, that he's heard from someone today that Florida's coaching staff has been complaining, you love to hear that, about having to add Alabama to their schedules. If this is true, then Alabama will have a non-division game against Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee. Pretty tough road, he says, for the Crimson Tide. However, it's the Florida part of this that I think is interesting. This would seemingly confirm the rumblings that possibly Alabama will be on Florida's schedule. We'll have to wait and see about that. But it definitely brings to mind what some people have been speculating about on social media, that the initial plan to add both Alabama and Texas A&M was the kind of thing that Florida was going to whine about. Maybe that is indeed the case here. However, beyond just reveling in the fact that Florida may be unhappy, and around here as Gator haters, we obviously enjoy that, I think there's something else kind of instructive that you want to point out to here, which is this is supposed to be Florida's year. It would stand to reason if Florida is as good as everyone says they are, then wouldn't Alabama, at least theoretically, shouldn't Alabama be just as concerned about playing Florida as Florida is about playing Alabama? I mean, after all, you look at last year's college football playoff ranking, Florida finished the year at 9th. Alabama lost 2 games, finished the year 13th. From a rating standpoint, record standpoint, you could almost say that Florida is even better than Alabama a year ago. There's certainly been plenty of off-season praise for the Gators thus far. Let me give you a little taste of that. Jordan Rodgers on a streaming video that the SEC network did. Listen to how high a guy like Rodgers is on the idea of the Gators. Here's the SEC network's Jordan Rodgers.
I look at Florida and I go, it's got to be now. I mean, it has to be. When you look at Georgia, they got Jamie Newman, who didn't have a chance to have a full spring, maybe not a full summer, new offensive coordinator, new quarterback. You lose 3 guys on the up front and the O-line to the NFL draft. You look at Florida, their quarterback's back. Both their quarterbacks. I think Emory Jones is going to have a bigger role this year, but this is Kyle Trask's team. They have talent all around. And the biggest question mark for Florida last year was, can they run the football? This offensive line, are they good? Sometimes they show up, sometimes they don't. This is going to be the most experienced unit in the SEC with no spring ball in Florida when they come back in fall camp. I think they got a chance to be really good. So this has got to be Florida's year.
One of the things we've said a lot over the course of the offseason is that narrative, as expressed by Jordan Rodgers, he's far from the only national media type person who's pushed that idea, who's pushed that narrative. This is Florida's year. They've got the quarterback. They've got experience along the offensive line. They've got this. They've got that. And yet what has always been fascinating to me, and obviously I'm not objective on this. I'm biased. I'm a Georgia fan, but I believe I'm pointing out something that's nonetheless true. What's always been interesting to me is how few people outside of Gainesville, Florida, seem to actually believe this beyond the hot take guys, the TV analyst type guys who are trying to make this case. Frankly, in some cases, if you follow Gators message boards, especially with all the recruiting losses that Florida's racked up over the course of the last couple of months, I'm not even sure how many Florida fans actually believe stuff like that to the degree that someone like Jordan Rodgers tries to sell it. And if it was true, if this really was Florida's year, this was really the kind of team that had finished in the top 10 the last 2 years, validating it as a legitimate playoff contender here this year, then there ought to be as many Alabama fans complaining about playing Florida as there are Florida fans complaining about Alabama. Now, some people say, well, Alabama fans are they're unrealistic. They live in a dream world. They think their team's impervious to being beaten by anyone. That's not necessarily true. Alabama fans have complained plenty about schedules in the past. For instance, the number of bye games, BYE, days off for opponents the week before they play Alabama. That's the kind of thing that Alabama fans have pointed out plenty in the past. Bama fans aren't above complaining when they think they've been handed a raw deal from a schedule. But if you don't see Bama fans on message boards, on social media, complaining about playing Florida, if that's indeed the way this plays out, to the same degree you see Florida fans complaining about playing Alabama, then that ought to be pretty telling in terms of how folks really feel about the current state of college football. It's easy for a TV guy to make a case for Florida when the producer tells you that's what the program needs. It's far different to look at how you've heard the wisdom of crowds before, groups of people, what they collectively believe. It's far different to see how much the wisdom of crowds kind of moves in that way. Florida being treated the same way a program like Alabama would be treated right now, or frankly a program like Georgia, which has beaten the Gators 3 years in a row. In many ways, I'm more interested in that reaction than I am in anything else. All right, I'm going to get Connor Riley here coming up in just a moment. Let me tell you about one piece of news before we move on and speak to Connor. I told you yesterday about Inside the Huddle, a big event coming for DawgNation. It's 1 week from today. It's Tuesday, August the 11th. Now, tickets just $10. Here's the news, though. I told you this was very limited, and I was not, puffery when I said that. We've essentially sold out, so we have no tickets left for this event. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do, though. There is a waiting list. If this is something you'd like to be a part of, this is very, very limited. This is not like thousands of people or anything like that. Outdoor, or I should say in-person events where we, at, some of the places we've gone to, we can house as many people as we can take. For something like this, we're going to give people a chance to interact and ask questions and talk with me and Mike Griffith. We have to keep it limited, otherwise no one can get a word in edgewise. So these are very limited events. This is a very limited event. But if you go and sign up for the waiting list, I'm going to try to see, can we get a second one of these scheduled? So we are sold out on the first event that we're doing next Tuesday on August the 11th. We're going to try to do a second one. I'm going to push to see if we can make that happen. But you've got to sign up on the waiting list to find out when that goes down. So the bottom line here is tickets for the 11th sold out. Sign up for a waiting list and go to DawgNation.com. You can find out more about that. We will see about adding a second one of these, and I'll make information available about that once I find out. So Inside the Huddle is going to be a lot of fun. A few of you lucky enough to get in there, get your tickets for that. We've got maybe another one coming if I can convince them to do it, but you've got to go to the waiting list, DawgNation.com, for more details on that topic. All right? Any questions? All right. If not, let's move on. I'm going to talk about the two subjects I just mentioned with Connor Riley and some more to get into with him. Always fun to have him. A little different to have him on the phone, but nonetheless, we'll talk to Connor Riley here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
I'll bring in Connor Riley here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Many days, Connor is our insight, in-studio producer, pushing on the buttons, making everything work. Today, Connor does not have to do double duty as both guest and magician behind the scenes. He gets to just be a guy to talk on the show. So, Connor, welcome back to the program. Hope you're doing well.
As always, it's great to be on, and, the technical aspects should run a little bit better today, and, unfortunately, you still have to deal with me as a guest.
Well, listen, I'm glad to be doing that. Happy to have you here. Let me bring you in on a topic I was discussing before you joined us, and as I said, Connor, there's plenty in college football right now that sometimes we have to get kind of serious about and roll up our sleeves, and there's probably some arguments that generate some hard feelings on both sides. That's just kind of a fact of life living in 2020. Some arguments, though, are just for fun. This is an example of an argument that's just for fun that I don't think there's necessarily a wrong answer for. But on the heels of Jared Wilson committing yesterday, I started the show by saying, I believe that right now Matt Luke is Georgia's best recruiter among the assistant coaches. Do you agree? And if not, who do you make a case for?
So I'm going to just be inclined to disagree with you just on general because it feels way too takey. He hasn't really been here long enough, and I would say the work, the Michael Morris, Dylan Fairchild, even Amarius Mims, which is the big fish that Luke, I believe, still has to reel in. A lot of that work was done, by Sam Pittman and by Kirby Smart in the past as well. I still think Del McGee is an excellent recruiter. I know he's not necessarily the primary guy on a lot of guys, but he does such a great job relating with players, bringing guys in, especially in the sort of metro Atlanta area. And I think he, to me anyway, is probably the guy that leads off. I would also mention a Dan Lanning here as well. I think those two guys are probably, in my opinion, the top two guys, because while they might not be the sort of lead guy like Luke is on some prospects, I believe that when they need someone to go in and sort of make a bigger pitch or clean things up, so to say, I think those are the two guys that go in and do it.
I want to talk more about McGee here in a moment. Let me make the case for Luke, though, in this regard. I believe you're 100% right to say that he stepped into a pretty robust situation, strong relationships that had been pre-established by Pittman, and just the overall profile of the Georgia program led by Kirby Smart. This is a pretty cozy place for offensive linemen to want to be a part of. Totally agree with you on that. However, there was plenty of opportunity for some of those 2020 guys to slip away. Maybe most notably Tate Ratledge, although if you just follow the very letter of the online chatter, Brodie Jones was supposed to be taking visits to Auburn, things like that. If you're only a casual observer of recruiting, I think you could have viewed both Ratledge and Jones as potentially big fish that could have slipped off the hook a year ago. I do think that Luke deserves some credit for not allowing that to happen. And to think about how successful Georgia offensive line recruiting was in 2020, to see the 2021 momentum as well established as it is, as of right now, I think it's the best of the Georgia position groups, although there is a 5-star quarterback in play, so maybe that's taken with a grain of salt. To see the work that's been done with 2021, knowing that 2020 was a pretty deep year for pretty well-known signees, I think that you've got to find some level of this credit to carve out and give to Luke alone, even though that he was stepping into a job scenario that was already pretty well established.
Right, and what we know about Luke from his time as the Ole Miss head coach is that his players loved him. His players, I believe, when they were threatening to sit out when he was fired, and I don't necessarily believe that he should have been fired in the manner that he had been. But and again, I think he's going to continue to be a very good recruiter and potentially every bit as good as Dan Pittman, who we were saying for a long time was the best offensive line recruiter and offensive line position coach in the country. And again, I think Luke, because he does have that head coach experience, I think it's a little different when you're able to go out and sort of have that experience in your back pocket. I still think Del McGee is an excellent recruiter. I still think Lanning is really good. And I'm, disagreeing with you to disagree with you, and maybe not just go with the flavor of the month right now.
No, I totally understand that. Let's talk about Del McGee for a moment, who you mentioned, and I think this is a great candidate. And I want to be very careful how I speak for the next minute or so, because as a fan, I love Del McGee. I think Del McGee's a future head coach at the college level. I think that Georgia's incredibly lucky to have him. And yet, honesty compels me to admit, and maybe this is the fault of people like me more so than it's the fault of McGee, but we've probably talked more over the last couple of years about running back that Georgia didn't get than running backs that Georgia did get. And in some cases, some of that hype has turned out not to be really worth all of it yet. John Emery Jr. hasn't done much yet at LSU. Maybe that changes this year, but the preseason magazines don't project him as a starter. You think about the IMG running back, for whatever reason his name's escaping, who ended up at Alabama. We'll have to wait and see kind of what goes down with that. There was obviously the Tank Bigsby's, the Zach Evans for the class of 2020. There are still some very unanswered questions about who joins Lavassier Carroll as running back here in 2021. One of two things would seem to be going on here. Either blowhards like me are just hyping the wrong running backs, or in some cases, quietly, Georgia's missed on a couple of running backs that it would have liked to have had to pair with, Kendall Milton, the class of 2020, other examples here, McIntosh, the class of 2019. One of the two things would seem to be somewhat true.
Well, I would point out that Georgia did technically sign Zach Evans. He just did not end up enrolling with the program, and they ended up letting him go. And again, yes, Tank Bigsby had a higher rating than him. Kendall Milton's still a top 60 prospect in the country from Fresno. That was a contested recruitment with, Alabama, Ohio State, who I believe did not sign a running back last year, and would very much have liked to have signed one, especially a player of Milton's caliber. And another thing right now, because some of the top running backs in this 2021 cycle, we know Evan Pryor, Travion Henderson, they both ended up at Ohio State. With the way those sort of went, you're wondering, what is this with McGee? But if visits are allowed again, and specifically Donovan Edwards, a very good running back out of Michigan, if he's able to come back down and visit, and Georgia's able to get him on campus, which, again, these are all big ifs right now. But if that's the case and that's allowed to happen, I think we're going to be talking about Del McGee once again as one of the best recruiters. And I think the thing, for me anyway, that really separates McGee from Luke right now is that while, yes, they're both sort of in charge of recruiting their positions specifically, I think what McGee, for me, gives McGee the edge is the work he's able to do with players who aren't just at his position. We know, how well he's been able to relate to kids and how he's been able to, even guys that he's not going to specifically coach, but make them feel comfortable about coming to the Georgia program.
I want to talk about some of the things you've written at DawgNation.com. Let me bring you in on one more topic that I addressed before you joined us. I gave the theory that there's some chatter out there that Florida is complaining about maybe having to play Alabama. Now, I love the idea of the Gators whining. That's fun for me. But beyond that, I think it's also instructive. And kind of what I told the audience was, look at the way that Alabama fans respond to, if it does indeed happen, the way that Alabama fans respond to having to play Florida compared to the way that Florida fans respond to having to play Alabama. Now, over the course of the Saban era, Alabama's had great success, but a year ago, Florida finished 9th, Bama 13th, Bama lost twice. That there is a way of listening to the media chatter on all of this. This is Florida's year. This is the kind of team that ought to strike fear in the heart of its opponents. But let's watch Alabama fans. If they find out last minute they have to play Florida, let's find out how much true fear Florida really does strike in a fan base that hasn't been spending the entire offseason knowing that game is coming. Alabama, as I said, lost twice a year ago, and yet Florida fans treat that, rightly so I believe, as a potentially dangerous game. I wonder if Alabama fans will feel the same way about Florida. And if they don't, my prediction is they won't, but if they don't, I think it shows some of the media chatter about Florida during this offseason to maybe be a bit hollow, motivated more by a producer who wants action on a TV show than anything that's more substantial than that.
Well, I think the thing with Florida and the reason there was such a big case to make for them as a potential SEC East winner, and some people even gone as far to say a college football playoff contender, is because of how soft the schedule was this year. Yes, you play LSU, but LSU doesn't figure to be nearly as good as they were a season ago. You get Ole Miss as your cross-divisional game instead of Auburn like they did a season ago. And you look at what Georgia had to play. They had to play Alabama. They had to play Auburn. Those are admittedly tougher SEC West games than I think we're going to see from Florida this year. And so the schedule, and I think the reason the complaining, I put that in air quotes, but the reason, you're worried about that is because for Florida, the schedule component was, I think, a big reason why they were sort of getting the hype that they were. Whereas if they had to play, say LSU and Auburn again, for instance, this year as their cross-divisional game, I don't think that level of hype and sort of what Florida fans had sold themselves for months on would have been at the same level.
Let me move on here. Georgia's not going to play Georgia Tech this year. You had a very passionate argument you made a couple of times on DawgNation, whether it's our Cover 4 presented by Georgia Farm Bureau or your own content, about how important you think this rivalry still is. And we had John Stinchcomb on the show yesterday. He said something kind of similar to that. Connor, that personally, I just don't feel that strongly about it. I'm not, if the game went away and was never played again, I wouldn't shed any tears over that. However, it has been interesting for me to see people like you argue for why it should be reinstated in 2021 and still really important to hear former players kind of say some of the same kind of stuff. It's almost like through all of this, taking the game off the schedule for a year, I've noticed a little bit of, renewed sense of appreciation for what the in-state rivalry means, clean old-fashioned hate. These are two very different programs. I think the rivalry sometimes is too passive-aggressive, both sides kind of pretending to ignore the other, I think, a little too much. It's been interesting for me to hear how many people, yourself included, pretty vocal on this, really think the Tech rivalry still matters.
Yeah, well, I think there's two reasons for the way in which I feel about it. One is just, my background. I grew up Roswell, Georgia, North Atlanta, that area. There's a lot of Tech kids. There are a lot of my good friends from high school went to Georgia Tech.
So you're a rich kid, in other words.
I'm not a rich kid. You very well know that, Mr. Cumming, Georgia. But coming from the area I come from, the Tech thing. The first college football game I ever went to was a game at Georgia Tech. So there is always a little bit of an inclination to want to see Georgia play them and beat them because much like people who grew up in the Chattanooga area, people who grew up in Columbus, when they play Auburn, people in South Georgia when Georgia plays Florida, because of sort of where they are in the location of the state, certain games mean more to them. The other big reason, and I think this is the thing I've harped more on, is with college football and the way it's going, it's clear that they're just going for the most money, the biggest bang for your buck possible. We've already seen, Georgia's traditional November game with Auburn get moved up for reasons that don't exactly feel great and aren't for the best, I believe, of Georgia football. You can get rid of the Georgia Tech game and say, hey, let's go play at Clemson every year. Let's go play in Ohio State. Let's go play another big boy, get more money, big bucks. Sure, you take that tradition off. You and I have talked about this. We both feel very, I think, similar on this, is that eventually they're going to move the Georgia-Florida game out of Jacksonville for, that recruiting weekend, whatever excuse that they want to use for that. And that's just another tradition that's going to be gone. At the end of this, all the traditions that we hold dear in college football are eventually just going to be stripped away because to chase more money, to, rack up dollars and things like that. And ultimately, I think that's terrible for college football because at that point, you're just trying to turn it into an NFL version of the sport, and it won't be nearly as good as the NFL will be. And to me, what makes college football so great, and so passionate, and so special, is that you have these traditions, these things that, to the outside or to the uninformed might be kind of dumb, but to someone who follows the program as closely as you or I or some of the many DawgNation Daily listeners, taking those away just makes it a little less special, a little less weird, a little less fun. And at the end of the day, if we don't have any of those, it's going to be very hard to look at the sport of college football that so many of us for so long have so loved and sort of recognize it for what it is.
I think that's a really strong argument. I really do, and I like the way you say all of that. And the time we have left, let me focus on something that you've written at DawgNation.com about how the delayed start to the season, longer time to get ready, potentially benefits some Georgia players. And there's one category in particular that really sticks out to me. Now, you mentioned a few, and I hope people will read this for themselves at DawgNation.com. But it's the wide receiver spot for me that really matters here, partially because, as you pointed out, it's a Dominic Blaylock injury recovery. That's really important. But, Connor, also one of my closely held beliefs is when you see a guy like George Pickens have a great freshman season, and Pickens, I think, really did. Other people around college football have had, maybe statistically speaking, even better freshman seasons. Justin Ross at Clemson, Jerry Jeudy a couple years ago to Alabama. But when you have these outlier performances, ultimately, I think it tricks our brain into thinking that receiver is easier to play as a freshman than it really is, because the preponderance of evidence suggests, the non-Jeudy, Pickens, Ross type players, the preponderance of evidence suggests this is still a pretty tough spot to play as a freshman. And for these guys who had no spring practice, and in some cases they were going to be summer enrollees anyway, to show up, to have a longer ramp to start the season, my gosh, I really feel pretty confident saying I think you get better performances from at least some of these guys, if not across the board, because of the fact that the season is delayed. And that's not in of itself a reason to delay a season, but it is kind of an ancillary benefit. I completely agree with your premise on the entire idea for the receivers in particular, in my mind.
Right, and you look at guys like Justin Ross and George Pickens, guys who did have, we think big freshman seasons. A lot of their work came at the end of the season, especially after the bowl game, where they had those extra practices at the end of the year to sort of get acclimated and get adjusted. So having those now on the front end, assuming Georgia does start practice on August 9th this Sunday, which would be the first day they'd be allowed to do it based on the NCAA protocol, and they still haven't made an official call on that yet. But those guys are going to end up getting more practice back than they would have had for spring practice. So, and all the freshmen are going to have access to that. So for guys like Jermaine Burton and Marcus Roseman, who are healthy right now, and Justin Robinson as well, having those extra practices, I think, is a long way in sort of, as you just laid out, not only having them ready to contribute for the entirety of the freshman year, but having them ready to go earlier on in the season, because right now we don't know when that Alabama game is going to be, because it was set to be September 19th, so that's going to have to be pushed back due to the September 26th start date. But let's say that game is October 3rd, or even, it's the first game Georgia plays September 26th. Having those extra practices makes me feel more comfortable that those guys are ready to go and potentially ready to contribute in that game, just because they're going to have their bearings and their feet underneath them of knowing what it's like to play in a college football atmosphere.
Connor, really good stuff. Thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll look forward to reading more from you at DawgNation.com, and, of course, chatting with you very soon again as well.
Yep, as always, a pleasure, B.A.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, the other position I'd say that's really true for, and I'm sure Connor wrote this, I honestly don't remember what he said in the story about this, even though I did read it, was what's going to happen at right tackle, where there have been reports. Jeff Sintel wrote about this at DawgNation.com. One of the guys thought to be a part of that conversation, Brodie Jones, has suffered some sort of off-season injury. Sources close to him have said it's not a serious injury. Well, if it's not a serious injury, then a little bit more time to get ready just means it's more likely that he's able to be a part of that competition, whereas shorter time frame would obviously mean the opposite. And for guys like Warren McClendon or Xavier Truss, you want to evaluate them in that intense competition, more intense than they've been in the past, because more is asked from them, at least potentially here in the 2020 season. I also think that none of us are happy that the season is delayed. None of us are as happy as things are as weird as they are, but things have a way of working out for some people. Weird circumstances have a way of accidentally benefiting some people, and there's some Georgia players, as Connor pointed out, that may, in a roundabout way, benefit from some of this kind of stuff. Before we move on to the rest of our SEC through, let me talk about the Atlanta Braves here for a moment. Now, the Braves had no way to sugarcoat this, an awful setback last night when Mike Soroka, the young ace of this pitching staff, tore his Achilles. This is not good news. And you hate it for Soroka, who, by the way, celebrates a birthday today. Some lousy birthday that is for him. Soroka's one of the best young pitchers in all of baseball, and now he's out. However, this has not done anything for me to dampen my excitement for the Braves season, even though it's obviously a huge challenge, whether it be Max Fried or the other pitchers in this rotation, maybe a chance for some younger guys to step up. I'm really very eager to see how the Braves respond. In fact, I think you've already heard some good stuff from Freddie Freeman on this in terms of next man up, how you step up. It's a major setback when a guy like Soroka's not able to pitch for you. But the Braves are looking to respond here on this, and watching how they do that. They had won 5 straight going into the game last night where the Soroka injury occurred. So this is a team that's played some pretty good baseball in this shortened season when every game matters more, when you're only playing the National League East, when you've got those American League East games there as well. You've brought the designated hitter into the National League this year. It's all really fun. Braves.com/schedule to keep up with what's going on for the Braves when they come back home to Truist Park, when they're on the road, when they're trying to make a run back to the postseason. Braves.com/schedule, the best way to keep up with what is a very strange year around Major League Baseball, but the Braves doing their part to be right in the thick of the competition for the National League East. All right, so yesterday I kind of made a big point on the show that college football is a volunteer activity. And in the face of what's going on with the coronavirus, in the face of some complaints that some people have about the way that this sport operates, we should not lose sight of the fact that this is still a volunteer activity, an activity the players who play choose to be a part of. And if I'm going to tout that on the one side, then I've got to be okay when other players say, well, it is my choice not to play, and so therefore I might not. What's interesting here is, and I'm going to have to put my fan hat back on for a minute, Kadarius Toney from the Florida Gators put out a very cryptic tweet about the idea that he might not play this upcoming season. Toney's one of the Gators' most important offensive players. Another one of those very important offensive players, Jacob Copeland, former four-star receiver, kind of jumped in and echoed a similar sentiment. So what Toney said on Twitter was, opting out just might be the better decision. Copeland retweets that and says, thinking it over, you honestly might be right. So once again, I've got to support players if they decide they don't want to play, especially if it's because of concerns over their health and safety. Now, as a Georgia fan, I get, and I hate to be this way because obviously the COVID's a very serious thing, but I get a little bit of a chuckle about the idea of, you know, a couple of the big Florida receivers maybe deciding not to play this upcoming season. As a fan, you can't help but notice that. The other thing about this that's just weird to me is how comfortable Florida has always been. It's not a Dan Mullen thing. This was true under Jim McElwain. Florida has always been very comfortable with Florida players airing a lot of their, we call it dirty laundry or just innermost thoughts, whatever else. There's always a lot of social media drama with Florida players. This is not Copeland's first foray into this there as well. The decision to opt out is a serious one. Teasing it on social media as a way of, you know, to Florida fans saying, hey, we might not, you know, that's the kind of thing that Florida has just always been way more comfortable with that kind of stuff. So this is a story worth watching here as more Gators players take their grievances public, their considerations public, and Toney, Copeland, two of the bigger names in the Florida roster, considering not playing this upcoming year. Now let me shift gears and do something a little bit more serious here for a moment. We talked to you yesterday about the Pac-12 players who've apparently banded together. A little bit more than a dozen have signed their name to something. Rumors of hundreds more who are involved in this, unsatisfied with the relationship, the agreement that they have as amateur athletes with the college football system. They've got some big changes they want to make. As I've said before, I think some of the negativity sometimes you see around the coronavirus, I think coincidentally or not, also in the media ranks comes from people who seem to be cheerleaders for those who want to question the college football model that has worked over the course of the last 150 years. I've suggested that I don't believe that's necessarily a coincidence. There are some people who want to, I think, topple the system. And as someone who believes in the system, as someone who believes the college football system has done well for people, that's something I'm obviously very skeptical of. Now, there's an interesting piece of news that's worth adding into this discussion. If you read the report, and I believe it was The Athletic, that said the thing that got the Pac-12 players started, and if you haven't read a lot about that, there's a million places where you can go to kind of find out more about their current beliefs and the things they want to see changed. Apparently, this was all started by a report that appeared in CBSSports.com. Now, I'm going to do this kind of quick, but this is important. Headline from June 30. Coronavirus in college football. Hospitalizations, deaths projected by data analysts if football plays in 2020. The subhead, COVID-19 does not discriminate. Young athletes are not immune to complications. Dennis Dodd was the writer. The money quote from someone who, by the way, is not an epidemiologist or a doctor. He's a computer data scientist. What the guy told Dennis Dodd was that a few players could end up in the hospital and you'll have a small number who could die. I don't want to sugarcoat it for you. I just want to give you the facts. If everybody comes together under normal circumstances, we'll probably see that kind of outcome. However, upon that story being used as a motivation for the Pac-12 players who are threatening to, I guess, strike or boycott or whatever it is they're doing, Dennis Dodd goes back to the same computer data analyst about his COVID projection, knowing it was the catalyst for all of this. This guy's completely changed his mind, telling Dennis Dodd this week at CBSSports.com, I'm trying to find a reason to tell you they shouldn't play football. I haven't found it yet. He's completely softened his stance. Now, it's worth pointing out that him as a non-doctor, non-epidemiologist, his original findings were questioned anyway. He seems to now be questioning the findings that he originally brought to light. This is all, I think, rightly treated with suspicion. At least I think it probably should be, which is not to say the coronavirus in and of itself is not a strong, potentially serious thing that college football players should be thinking about. There was a mother of an Indiana University player who this week has come out on Facebook saying that her son's gotten sick from COVID, and is apparently pretty hard up on the basis of that. So the illness in and of itself should be treated seriously. But when people with limited credentials are given such an amplified voice to project the most dire circumstances possible, to get people worked up into a frenzy, and that same person goes back and essentially retracts that claim later on, or certainly softens his stance, I think people rightly are going to have their eyes open to that, eyebrows raised if nothing else, and we'll make that your SEC through. All right, here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, let me turn my attention back to Georgia for a moment. We talked to Connor Riley about, hey, the Georgia players, if you want to keep this between the white lines of football for a moment, the Georgia players that potentially benefit from a delayed start to the season. There's also some practical considerations from the SEC is waiting until much later in September to at least attempt to kick off this upcoming year. When Georgia AD Greg McGarity spoke with the reporters last week, he talked about what the value of that was, what the league hopes to gain from a delayed start. Here is what McGarity said then.
We certainly listened to our medical professionals and felt like a later start would really put us in a better position from a health standpoint. We'd be able to observe what's going on for those that may start on time. We'd be able to see what happens in the NFL and just have more data to compare before we started. So all those things lined up, and certainly there were a lot of robust discussion in the room, but we all landed and agreed that the 10-game schedule was where we needed to end up.
I mean, listen, ultimately, I think in addition to the very serious considerations around the virus and everything else, I think there is a tactical brilliance to the SEC choosing to start later on in September that should not be discounted here. For whatever reason, I think unfairly, college football has been singled out in its attempt to return to live action. Major League Baseball is ongoing right now in a non-bubble situation. The NBA, MLS, NHL may be in a bubble, but if you want to go back to March and listen to what some national media members were saying then about the efficacy of bubbles, that tune has greatly changed over the course of the last couple of months there as well. By college football waiting, I think whether they intended it to be this way or not, here's how it's going to work out. They can point to actual colleges and schools themselves trying to return to action, educating their students, other sports leagues trying to return back and say, hey, see, we're not the only one. Listen, I have no idea if this is going to work. I don't know if college football is going to be able to take place this fall. I think there's nothing wrong with trying, especially if you're working hard to keep players safe. I ever believe that's what the SEC is doing, and then we'll have to just sort of wait and see how it all plays out. And as we wrap up, I will remind you, Gator Hater Updater, always a fun thing to do on a day like this when we let you know that a good Georgia fan is a Gator hater. First and foremost, it's the rivalry that matters most. I thought Connor Riley made an impassioned plea for why the Tech rivalry does matter. And I guess for someone like me who gives a lot of energy over to, the cocktail party and everything else, there's sometimes just not a lot left over for a school like Georgia Tech, but clearly for some fans that means something. However, we continue to stand on our post that the Georgia-Florida rivalry ought to matter the most, and it's been 1,375 days since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. You love that if you're a UGA fan, the excitement that builds, but the fact that number could keep climbing this upcoming season, that's really fun as well. Thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Hope you have a great day, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you back here again tomorrow. And on video. Time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric. You can trust R.S. Andrews to do all of that for you. They certainly do all of that for us here. And if you are concerned that your air conditioning unit still got, listen, the hottest days of the year are still yet to come. You know that about Georgia. Later into August, into September, those are the hottest days we have. Sometimes October can still be a very hot month around here. So air conditionings aren't done by a long shot. If you're concerned about yours, get it tuned back up to factory fresh specs. Find our friends at rsandrews.com for a lot more on that. All right, let me pop over here. Now, I will say the late start today puts me in a little bit of a bind. I don't have very much time for comments today, and I apologize. Let's do 10 strong minutes for those of you who are still here, and we will see if we can get you going. All right, let's see what. Here we are. So we'll take some of your comments. Chad Williams on the subject of the Dogs find a Nugget Warren as someone they're still looking to chase down, so that's exciting. Keith Fold says a staff from the ticket office told me they're sending out an email to season ticket holders this week regarding seating, refunds, etc. Yeah, this is a prediction on my part. This is not a report. I'm sure they'll try to do some sort of incentive for season ticket holders, some sort of bonus or something like that. If you're willing to not accept a refund, once again, that's not a prediction. That's not a report. That's just a prediction or a guess on my part that they're going to try to do something to keep the season ticket holders happy, because obviously there are a lot of folks who are going to be left, not being there. Al Chandler says, what are we hearing about any workouts? Obviously, the next big piece of news to find out is if practices do begin starting this upcoming weekend, moving into next week. Kind of extended practice period it potentially could be. We're still waiting to hear official full word on that. But as far as the coach observed workouts that have been going on the last couple of weeks, everything that I've heard about those continues to suggest they've been going really well. And young players have been integrating themselves into the experience, and they're really getting a pretty good build-up to start the year, different than they otherwise would have gotten, especially for the guys who are planning on being summer enrollees anyway. Nathan Edwards says they'll probably let you roll it over as a donation for next year. Yes, some people won't want to do that. They're going to want their money back. Georgia obviously benefits from as few people as possible asking for that refund. So there's some potential enticements they could provide to keep people from asking for the refund. This is, like I said, this is just a prediction as someone who's been a ticket buying fan before, just kind of thinking how some of this kind of stuff might work. So you'll see how that goes. Robert Barnes says when it comes to the virus, all we can do is do our part as individuals. Totally agree with that. I think it's important that we do that. It's good to pitch in and work together. I think that is good. Lucy Bowers-Boykin says, what do the practice schedules look like? We're still waiting to find out all of that. I think one of the things that you have to think about here is that there are still, the NCAA likes to put a cap on things, right? 20-hour work week, things like that. Are they going to let these teams just go unfettered with, this long of a build-up worth of practices? There's a reason why they delay it and make them start when they do. Will they give them the freedom to have these longer practices? I hope they do. Phil Rogers says, what's your take on the Florida situation? We have 50,000 fans in Jacksonville. As it stands right now, I can't make that prediction. I mean, we heard Ohio State come out and say that right now they're expecting to have no fans in Columbus right now. Unfortunately, while there is still a very good chance that the games themselves take place, the notion of fans in the stands, anything that feels like a normal college football game in terms of what happens outside the white lines, right now I don't have much hope for that really at all. Now, could the world be a different place by October the 31st, the original date this game was scheduled? Maybe it could be. But as it stands right now, I just don't believe it probably will be, if I had to guess. Al Chandler says, when do the ADs vote on this year's schedule? So it's not necessarily an AD vote, but in terms of when we will find out about it, I think we're all on guard to find out about it at any time. When the ACC made their announcement, they dropped the schedule at the same time they announced it. The SEC, there had been some rumblings that may come out this past Friday. The SEC office said that's not the case. There had been some social media chatter that might come out yesterday. That obviously didn't happen. It could still be a while from now. I think one of the things that kind of is somewhat coupled with this discussion is the ticketing thing that we just talked about. That in terms of finding out, because a lot of these games, remember, could be changed. There's no guarantee that Georgia plays, of the 8 SEC teams we know that it's playing, there's no guarantee that those dates remain the same. Now, they could. You could just add the 2 extra games to the end. But my guess is that there's a chance that some of that gets changed. So, and your bye weeks get changed. I know one of the things that has been talked about was, the notion that Alabama and LSU, for some reason, Glenn Guilbeau, who reports on LSU in Louisiana, for some reason he had a source that was saying there may not be an LSU bye before the Alabama game this year. How does he know that? I have honestly no idea. But that was one of the things that he had suggested. Philip Fulmer, the Tennessee athletic director, former coach, is pushing hard for the Tennessee-Alabama to remain third Saturday in October. Does Georgia-Florida in a year like this really want to stay on that Halloween date? If there's not going to be any fans in Jacksonville anyway, would they just be happy with some other date? I honestly don't know the answer to that. But part of the schedule announcement is also coupled with the ADs talking to their fans about tickets. I would say that those two those two news items maybe go hand in hand just a bit. Clay Dyke's hoping to play Arkansas. He says it'd be crazy to play against Sam Pittman, and it potentially kind of would. It would certainly be an unimaginable circumstance as recently as a few months ago. Let me go over here to YouTube for a moment. Nature Gator says the large majority of Florida fans want to play Alabama, just like the Florida AD wants to schedule them this year. Not sure where you came up with the counter view earlier, only reporting what's been said on social media about that. Scott Harris says, could college football games get canceled because of outbreaks like in Major League Baseball? If so, how do you determine champions? Too many questions. Yeah, I mean, that's one of like the things you have to be a little bit okay with is you go into a season not quite sure how it's going to end. And, I mean, I am firmly of the belief that if you play a 10-game schedule and that leads to a college football playoff and you crown a national champion that way, to me that's a totally legit season. It's fewer than 12 games, but you play the games that matter most, your conference games. It's a real playoff. I have no problem saying that's a national champion. If Georgia plays 6 games because of, COVID, whatever else, at that point in time, you just sort of have to say it's the year without a national champion. Now, there'll be a desire to crown one. There'll be a desire to claim one, especially for the school that wins it. But that, to me, is not legitimate. So that's just, for the most part, how I feel about that. Now, Georgia goes 6-0. Well, I maybe feel differently later on. I guess I reserve the right to change my mind. But this is one of those years. I joked about this during the regular show on Friday. We've heard it said before that Georgia and Florida don't even agree on the number of times they've played each other. It was unimaginable for me that I could ever live in a time in which a rivalry like that could be disputed. But let's say that Georgia and Florida play early in the year, Georgia wins the game, but then the season doesn't finish. It's almost like there'll be certain teams that want to declare that kind of a missed deal. It doesn't count. Whereas the teams that win will at least want to count that win against their rival. But any attempt to kind of crown a national champion on the basis of a partial season, I just don't think that's realistic. I'm not really sure, what the chatter has been about the college basketball season, but in the absence of a tournament, there is no national champion. Huck Finn says, what happens when 12 to 20 players in a team contract the virus? That's obviously a real question. It's a real consideration. I guess I was of the belief that if 12 guys contracted the virus, you would quarantine and isolate those 12, and you'd try to move on with the remaining scholarship players that you have, 70-something, whatever it would be. That's what I assume you would do. But we saw the Philadelphia Phillies stop playing baseball on the basis of just one positive test. It was a coach. And I'm not trying to downplay any of this, but some of the response to positive tests has been a little bit different than I assumed it would be. If we're going to try to move forward and have a college football season with the belief that it'll be shut down on the basis of just one positive test somewhere, we shouldn't even try to have it because, as the SEC officials were reported to say in that Washington Post story over the weekend, there will be some positive tests. This is a communicable disease. I mean, you cannot fully prevent its spread. You just can't. You may not be able to prevent the spread at all, but you certainly can't fully prevent its spread. There will be some transmission of the disease that takes place. And I'm not downplaying the potential significance of that. Based on what I think I understand, that's not enough to make me say we shouldn't try to have a season. I think it's a complicated situation, and I think clear-eyed, level-headed people have to arrive at the best possible conclusion they have. They can. Scott Harris says, if you think about a cluster of people testing positive, that there's a chance it all comes from within the same position group. There is a chance that's true. That's right. So, is there a creative way of mitigating against that? Here's one of the things I believe could possibly be true. If Kirby Smart believes he has a creative way to keep that from happening, there's a chance that he would be just as non-forthcoming about that as he is about strategic stuff, because anything that he thinks is a potential advantage for him, he doesn't necessarily want to say. So if Smart's got a clever way to keep wide receivers somewhat spaced from each other, he may talk about some of that kind of stuff. He may not. He has been pretty tight-lipped when it comes to how, in particular, George is handling some of the coronavirus stuff. And yet when he spoke about it publicly, the disease itself, he has been very sober in his words and certainly not downplaying, diminishing the disease in any way, and yet not exactly an open book about what Georgia's doing to work against it. So the assumption I draw from that is Georgia's clearly taking this seriously, working hard to be the best it can possibly be, but just not necessarily completely transparent about exactly how they're doing all of that. Noah says I should block Huck fan. For the most part, I don't block anybody as long, even people who are deliberately trolling. I say that you all should be free to block who you want. For the most part, I try to have a very slow block finger, just because I try to be as welcoming in an environment as you possibly can be. David Gross, funny line on Facebook. Marcinio asks you, I totally agree with this. He says, win a championship, develop first-round pick. That's all going to take care of any recruiting issue. I think Marcinio is almost 100% right about that. Philip Jordan Wells, good to see you. Speaking of being late, which Philip mentioned, I'm sorry we were late today, but we should be normal for a good while moving forward. All right, I've got to go. Mike Gay also brings up a really good point, that if for whatever reason the season gets canceled, I officially declare the Gatorade updater will keep climbing. The number will keep going up. There's nothing those lousy stinking Gators can do about that. If they don't get the chance to meet Georgia in the field and tote another L this year, the number's going to keep going back up until they have a chance to do something about that. We officially declare that. All right. Let's get ready to go here. We appreciate you being here, and we will talk to you tomorrow, 10 a.m. It's our R.S. Andrews cool down. You can stay up to date and in touch with R.S. Andrews. Your water heater goes out. In many cases, they can get it replaced for you the same day. You just got to find them online at rsandrews.com. You also check out the AJC for your Atlanta news now. I mentioned before the Soroka Achilles. It's bad news for Braves fan. You can read more about the reporting on that there at DawgNation.com. I'm sorry, not DawgNation.com. You almost certainly cannot read about that at DawgNation.com, but you can read about it at AJC.com. Also, how about delivery of beer, wine, and liquor into Georgians' homes? There's been a lot of changes in terms of where the alcohol is being consumed because of the coronavirus. Apparently, Governor Kemp's got some signed a bill on that. Read about that at AJC.com. And good news. Atlanta-based Home Depot adding 1,000 workers, expanding its distribution centers in Atlanta. You can find out more about that. AJC.com for your Atlanta news now. You have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then, everybody.